Montana Territory, September 1884. Dust rolled across the prairie as the last of Delaney Rowe's cattle were driven off her land by men who never even looked her in the eye. She stood on the porch of her late father's ranch house, jaw clenched, shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Her boots were covered in dirt, her dress torn at the hem, but she did not flinch as the riders disappeared into the horizon. They had the papers, signed with a forged name. The sheriff in Miles City claimed it was legal. The lawyer never returned her letters. She had no more cattle, no more land. Nothing but the old house behind her, and the ache of everything she had tried to hold together since her father died the year before, except for Wyatt. Her little boy stood behind her, one hand gripping the back of her skirt. He was 6, quiet like his father had been before he drank himself into the ground. "Mama," Wyatt whispered. "Where will we go now?" Delaney swallowed hard. "I do not know yet." She did not cry. She had done enough of that when the crops failed, when the bank stopped answering her notes, when the men came last week to burn her fences. But this final blow cut deeper than anything else. They had taken everything, and no one had stood up for her. Until a voice behind her broke the silence. "Ma'am." Delaney turned, startled, and saw a man sitting tall on a chestnut horse near the front gate. He had a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a rifle slung across his saddle. The horse shifted beneath him, steady as the man holding the reins. "I saw what happened," he said. "Riders from the Davis outfit." She nodded once, wary. "They said I forged the deed," she said the land was theirs now. "I do not believe that," the man said. He dismounted. His boots hit the dirt with a quiet thud. He was broad-shouldered, covered in trail dust, and looked like he had been riding a long time without much sleep. "I am Lawson Hart," he said, removing his hat. "I run cattle east of here, about 20 miles out." Delaney crossed her arms. "You with them?" "No, ma'am. I do not run with any man who pushes a woman off land she worked for." Wyatt peeked out from behind her skirt, squinting up at Lawson. Lawson crouched down a little. "What is your name, kid?" "Wyatt," Lawson nodded. "Good name." Delaney stepped forward. "Why are you here?" "I was trailing strays when I saw the dust, watched from the ridge, thought maybe someone ought to say something." "You said it," she muttered. "Now you can keep riding." Lawson studied her face for a long moment. "I could walk away," he said. "But I am not going to," she blinked. "What?" "I have seen a lot of wrong things out here. Most times, folks turn their heads and say it is not their business. But I got some room on my land, a spare cabin, nothing fancy, but it stays warm come winter." "You and your boy got anywhere else to go?" Delaney's throat tightened. "I am not looking for pity," she said. "Good," Lawson replied, "because I am not offering any." He stood there, quiet and steady, like a man who did not speak unless he meant every word. Delaney looked down at Wyatt. His face was pale, his lips pressed together. Her life had been ripped apart in hours. She had no money, no livestock, no way to start over, but Wyatt needed a roof. And this man, this stranger, was offering one. "How far is it?" she asked. "Few hours' ride," he said. "I have a wagon if you would rather ride in that." Delaney hesitated, then she nodded. "I will pack what is left." Lawson did not say anything more. He just turned and walked back to his horse. It took less than an hour to gather what they had. A few clothes, a Bible, Wyatt's wooden horse. A photo of her parents from before the war. Then she and Wyatt climbed into the wagon, and Lawson rode beside them down the rutted trail, the sun casting long shadows behind them. She did not know what waited ahead, but for the first time in weeks, there was no weight pressing on her chest. When they reached Lawson's land, it was nearly sundown. The cabin was small but solid, with a stone chimney and a front porch. A creek ran behind it, and the hills beyond were gold with late summer grass. Lawson helped Wyatt down from the wagon, then offered Delaney his hand. She took it, surprised by how warm and sure it felt. "I know it is not what you are used to," he said. "It is more than I had this morning." He nodded once. "You settle in, I will bring firewood." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and smoke. There was a small bed, a table, and a stove. Everything clean. Wyatt crawled onto the bed and curled up, exhausted. Delaney sat at the table, staring at the flame in the lamp Lawson had lit before stepping back outside. She did not know this man, but he had stood up for her when no one else had. And when he came back with an armful of wood and a quiet way about him, she realized something that caught in her chest. She was not alone anymore. Lawson set the fire, then stood and looked at her. "You do not owe me anything," he said. She met his eyes. "I know." But something in her heart had already started to shift, and sitting there in the warm light of a stranger's cabin, Delaney Rowe began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was not the end of her story. It was the start of another. The cabin walls creaked low in the wind before dawn, and Delaney rose from the cot where she'd slept beside Wyatt. The boy was still breathing slow, curled into the quilt Lawson had left folded by the stove. She tucked the edge higher over his shoulder and eased away without waking him. Outside, the sky was just beginning to pale. She stepped onto the porch in her shawl and watched the land slowly reveal itself, dry grass bent with frost, the creek silvered and still, hills holding their hush like prayer. A horse whinnied from the lean-to, and a moment later Lawson stepped around the corner with a bucket in one hand, steam rising from it. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, not asking more. "Water's heated." "There's coffee if you want it." Delaney hesitated, then followed him inside. While he poured 2 tin cups, she studied the room with clearer eyes. A saddle rested on a peg. A row of books sat on a shelf beside a whetstone and a folded map. The space was lived in, but tidy. He set 1 cup near her elbow and leaned against the counter. "Wyatt sleep all right?" He did. "It's the first time he hasn't called out in the night since we lost the cattle." Lawson didn't answer right away. He drank, eyes on the window. "You ever think of leaving Montana?" She shook her head. "My father's buried out near the cottonwoods. My mother too. I was born here. I know the wind, the dirt. I don't want to start over somewhere I can't read the sky." Lawson gave a quiet sound like understanding. "I've got work if you want it," he said. "It's not much. Just keeping chickens, mending gear. I could pay you in coin or trade." Delaney looked across the table. "You're offering me pay. You're not charity. You're capable." She studied his face then. The way he didn't flinch from her gaze didn't soften his words. Not many men treated women like they were built for more than waiting. Fewer still spoke plain and meant it. "I can cook," she offered. "So decently, and I know how to read ledgers. I've got ledgers that haven't been touched since spring." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "Then we've found a trade." He went back to the stove without answering. The quiet between them wasn't heavy, just real. That afternoon, Wyatt followed Lawson to the barn while Delaney hung wash behind the cabin. She could see them from the line, Wyatt holding a short rope, walking beside the bay gelding while Lawson showed him how to guide it. The boy's shoulders held less tension, his steps more sure. She didn't interrupt, just watched. When they returned, Wyatt's cheeks were pink from the wind and full of stories. "He let me feed the colt, said I can help again tomorrow." Lawson looked over. "If your ma agrees." "He can," Delaney said. Later, when Wyatt napped, she found Lawson behind the barn, splitting kindling. "I meant to ask," she said. "Why me?" He set the axe down, wiping his forearm. "Because the sheriff wouldn't. Because I've lost things too, and I know what it looks like when someone's about to fall through the cracks." He didn't say what he'd lost. She didn't ask. "I don't know how long we'll stay," she said. "You decide that, not me." She nodded, unsure how to name the feeling in her chest. It wasn't safety, not yet. But it was something close, a place to set her feet for now. Before heading back inside, she turned once more. "Thank you." Lawson didn't look away. "You're welcome, Mrs. Rowe." She held his gaze a moment longer, then went back to her boy. She didn't know what shape the coming days would take. But she knew this cabin stood on solid ground, and the man who lived in it had calloused hands and a heart that didn't rattle in the wind. Lawson came in from the pasture with dried mud up to his knees and a cut across one knuckle. Delaney glanced up from the table where she was sewing a torn sleeve of Wyatt's shirt. She didn't ask what happened. If he needed to tell her, he would. He set the rifle in the corner and poured water from the basin, scrubbing the dirt off without a word. The only sound in the room was the rasp of fabric under her needle and the soft rattle of the wind outside. "You ever been married?" she asked, not looking up. He dried his hands on the towel hanging by the stove. "No," she nodded once. "You're not what I expected." Lawson leaned against the doorframe. "What you expect? Someone who wanted something in return." "I do," he said. I want this place run right. I want peace when I come in at night. And I want Wyatt to have something better under his feet than dust and worry. Delaney tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. That's a long list. I've worked longer for less. Wyatt came in just before dusk, cheeks flushed and hair wind-tossed. He carried a smooth stone in one hand and held it out to her like a prize. Found it near the creek. Looks like a heart. She turned the stone over in her palm. It does. Lawson watched her tuck it into the shelf beside the window, beside a chipped ceramic pitcher and a folded strip of blue calico. He didn't say anything about it. Later, as the evening settled around them, Delaney stood beside the stove while Lawson sat on the porch steps, carving a piece of pine. She could see his profile through the open door, the way his shoulders moved steady with each stroke of the knife. "You never said what brought you to Montana," she said. "Left Kansas after the war," he answered without turning. "Too many ghosts there. Figured I'd do better somewhere no one knew my name, did you? Eventually." She stepped outside, arms crossed against the cooling air. "You lost someone," Lawson let out a breath, slow and even. "Two brothers, both younger, one didn't come back, one came back wrong." She didn't ask which side they'd fought on. It didn't matter. The ache was the same. "I buried my ma during a blizzard," she said. "My pa the spring after." The land kept getting smaller after that. He laid the carving knife across his thigh and looked up at her. "You ever think about marrying again?" She didn't answer right away. The last of the light was gold along the ridge, casting the sky in quiet fire. "I think about what Wyatt needs," she said, "and what I can't give him alone." Lawson stood, brushing sawdust from his pants. "He needs someone who won't leave him. I know." He stepped closer, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. "I'd give you my name," he said, voice low. "Not out of pity, not because you need saving, because I'd stand beside you, and because I trust you'd do the same." Delaney didn't speak for a long while. The air held the scent of pine and smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called. Finally, she met his eyes. "I'll think on it." Lawson nodded once, like that was enough. Inside, Wyatt's soft breathing carried from the cot. Delaney stepped in and closed the door behind her, her hand lingering on the latch. She looked once more at the stone on the shelf, shaped like a heart, and let her fingers rest against it. That night, she didn't dream about loss. Only the sound of boots on a porch, steady and near. By late October, the wind had turned sharper, carrying the scent of snow from the high ridges. Delaney stood on the edge of the garden, pulling up the last of the onions by their brittle stalks. Her hands were chapped, nails rimmed with earth, but the basket beside her was near full. Behind her, the cabin windows glowed with lamplight. Wyatt was inside, working on his letters at the table. Lawson returned just before dusk, leading a roan mare that hadn't been there before. The animal's left flank bore a fresh gash, dark with dried blood. He guided her slow, murmuring under his breath as he walked. Delaney met him near the barn with a clean cloth in hand. "That's not one of yours." "No," he said. "Found her tangled in wire near the ridge, no brand. I think she's wild broke." She didn't ask why he'd bothered. She already knew. They worked in silence, cleaning the wound, binding it tight. When they finished, Lawson stepped back and rubbed his neck with the back of his wrist. "She's got fight," he said. "Didn't kick once. She's lucky it was you that found her." He looked at her then, quiet and sure, and said, "Luck didn't have much to do with it." Delaney didn't answer. She followed him back to the porch, where he sat and began oiling the throat latch of a bridle. She waited until he'd finished with the buckle before speaking again. "Wyatt asked me this morning if he could call you something besides Mr. Hart." Lawson glanced up, eyes steady. "What you tell him? That it wasn't my place to say." He nodded once and set the bridle aside. "What would you want him to call me?" Delaney sat down beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "If we did this married, I mean it wouldn't be for show. I won't live in someone's shadow. And I won't take another man's silence for comfort. You wouldn't have to. I need more than shelter. I'd give you more, if you'd have it." She looked out toward the far pasture where the grass was already touched with frost. "I'd need to stand beside you." "Not behind. You already do." Delaney turned toward him, the porch light catching the curve of her cheek. "Then I'll stand with you, Lawson." He reached for her hand then, not with urgency, but with a kind of reverence, like he was holding something he'd never known how to ask for. She didn't pull away. Inside, Wyatt was asleep with his slate tucked beneath his arm. Delaney knelt beside the cot, brushing the hair from his brow. "You'll have a new name soon," she whispered, "one that won't be taken from you." The next morning, they rode into Miles City together. Delaney wore her mother's brooch pinned to the collar of her dress. Lawson shaved and wore his best coat, the one he hadn't touched since spring branding. They didn't speak much on the way. They didn't need to. The clerk at the courthouse looked at them over his spectacles. "You folks got your papers," Lawson handed them across. "We're ready," the clerk nodded and stood. "Preacher's upstairs, he'll see you now." Delaney didn't tremble. She kept her chin lifted as she took Lawson's arm. She didn't look back. The room was plain, just a desk, a Bible, a chair, but when the preacher spoke, Lawson's hand tightened gently around hers. "Do you, Lawson Hart, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" "I do." "And do you, Delaney Rowe, take this man to be your lawful husband?" "I do." When it was done, Lawson touched the side of her face just once before letting his hand fall. Outside, the sky was bright with wind-coiled clouds, the sun breaking through between them. They rode home slow, the wagon creaking under them, Wyatt between them with his hands in his lap. He didn't say much, but once, as they passed the split-rail fence near the creek, he looked up at Lawson and said, "Pa." Lawson didn't answer right away. He just reached over and settled a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's right." Delaney turned her face into the wind and let it carry that moment into her bones. They reached the cabin before nightfall. She stepped down first, then reached for Wyatt, then for the sack of flour they'd bought in town. Lawson took it from her. "You're not carrying everything anymore," he said. She smiled, tired but sure. "Neither are you." Inside, the fire was already laid, the hearth swept clean. The old place looked different now, not larger, but fuller, steadier. That night, before she banked the fire, Delaney stood at the window. The dark lay gentle over the land, and the stars were sharp and clear. She pressed her hand to the worn sill and whispered into the stillness, "We're home." The first snow came early. Not a heavy fall, but fine and dry, clinging to fence posts and the bare limbs of the cottonwoods outside the barn. Delaney walked the fence line with Wyatt bundled beside her, his boots crunching through the crusted white. She pointed out which slats needed replacing, and he nodded solemnly, taking each note like it was scripture. At the far end of the pasture, Lawson was knee-deep in fresh hay, spreading feed with a pitchfork. He looked up once, and when their eyes met, the corner of his mouth lifted not wide, just enough to say he saw her. She let her hand rest briefly on Wyatt's shoulder. "Go help him stack what's left by the wall. I'll see to the hens." He nodded and broke into a jog, arms stiff at his sides like he was holding in all the excitement of being needed. Inside the coop, it was warmer than she expected. The hens clucked low, shifting on their perches. She gathered eggs into the woven basket and ran her fingers along the sill where Lawson had sealed the draft last week. The repairs held. Everything they'd worked for these past weeks had started to settle into something firm beneath her. That evening, after supper, Wyatt sat on the rug by the hearth, carving a small figure from a block of pine. Lawson had lent him the pocket knife with strict instructions and a patient hand hovering nearby. Delaney sat at the table with a mending pile and a worn ledger. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and marked down the remaining sacks of oats, the cost of the nails they'd picked up from the smith, and how many more boards they'd need come spring. "You've a good head for numbers," Lawson said without looking up. She glanced over. "Better than I had for sewing." "My mother used to say my stitches looked like a drunk man's trail," Lawson chuckled softly. "Well, they're straight now." She set the pen aside and leaned back. "It's strange, isn't it, how quiet can feel full?" He rubbed his jaw. "I spent a lot of years thinking stillness meant something was missing. Now," he looked toward Wyatt, "now I think maybe it means something's been found." He stood, crossed to the shelf above the stove, and pulled down a small parcel wrapped in brown cloth. He brought it to her and set it on the table. Delaney raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Something I traded for last week. Was going to wait till Christmas, but I reckon today's just as good." She unfolded the cloth, revealing a length of calico deep blue with scattered sprigs of white flowers. Her breath caught. "I haven't had new fabric since before Wyatt was born." "I know." She looked up at him, her eyes wet but steady. "You remember everything." I try. He didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. She reached up, brushing her fingers along the edge of his coat sleeve. I want to make something for this place, she said. For us, not just hold it together but grow something inside it. You already have. He knelt beside her then, resting his hand over hers on the table. She turned her palm upward and laced their fingers together. I never thought I'd trust anyone again, she said. Not fully. You don't have to say it, he said. You live it. Every day. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently to his. I love you, Lawson. He closed his eyes, his breath deep and even. I love you, Delaney. The words didn't echo, they settled. That night, Wyatt fell asleep in the loft under the quilt she'd finished stitching just the week before. Delaney stood at the bottom of the ladder, watching his chest rise and fall, then turned to find Lawson at the door, bolting it for the night. Come sit with me, he said. She crossed the room, and he drew her into the rocker beside the hearth, pulling the wool blanket over both of them. The fire was low, casting long shadows on the floorboards. He held her hand, thumb tracing idle circles along her knuckles. Do you think your father would have liked it here? She nodded slowly. He would have liked you. He didn't say much, but he knew when a man was true. Lawson brushed his lips against her temple. We've got a good thing here, not easy, not perfect, but good. She rested her head against his shoulder, eyes growing heavy. It's more than I ever thought I'd have. You've got it now. For always. The wind picked up outside, whispering around the eaves, but inside the cabin the warmth held. Years passed. The garden grew in wide rows behind the cabin, with Wyatt tall enough to plow with the mule by the time he was 12. He carved better now than either of them, filling shelves with small horses and birds, each one more exact than the last. Delaney sold preserves and hand-stitched linens in town, her name known and respected. When folks spoke of her, it wasn't with pity anymore. It was with regard. Lawson's herd doubled, then tripled, not with speed, but with care. He built a second barn before his 50th year, and by then, every board on the place had passed through his hands or hers. They grew older together, with grace worn into them like the seams of a well-loved coat. They sat on that same porch each evening, her hand always resting in his, watching the sun dip behind the cottonwoods. And every night before the fire burned down, he would kiss her cheek and say, "Still good." And every night she would smile and say, "Yes, still good," because it was. Fully, finally, and always.